So just to give an overview of what we want to accomplish today and sort of, what we hope that you'll learn from this. So you may all know this, but this is the second in a three-part webinar series. And so 2 weeks ago, we had the overview session around the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court guidelines. And in that session, provided a little bit of background on sort of how the initiative came about, the sort of process behind the initiative, and then gave you an overview of each of the, objectives and the guidelines within that. Today and then the webinar in 2 weeks from today is meant to be a deeper dive into each of those statements that are in the guidelines. And so our hope is that you'll walk away with a little bit more knowledge, awareness of what is contained within the guidelines. And so it is broken into two parts so to allow enough time to sort of go into the content. And so the first part, we're going to cover the first three objectives in the guidelines, and we'll remind you a little bit about the organization before jumping in. And then the second part will be the remaining four objectives. And today you'll hear from a number of people, or three people really, around each of the statements. And so first, Roger will give you a little reminder about the statement itself, and then go into the research behind the statement, and then both Nancy and Jessica will talk about some of the practice considerations and some examples of this type of statement in practice. And so we hope you get the sort of breadth of research and practice that is related to each of the guideline statements. As Jessica said, we will pause for questions, but in order to try and cover the content, we're going to do it between the objectives. So we'll have 3 pauses. So just again, I'm not going to go into the whole background of the guidelines. If you're interested in that, please feel free to go back and review the recording from the first guideline. I will point out the website on the screen, also as Jessica said in the links in the webinar here, has all of this background information. And so the guidelines themselves were released by OJJDP in December of this past year in 2016. And just, really briefly, the focus of the guidelines is to be treatment-oriented towards substance use disorders and the often, mental health disorders that youth experience who come in contact with the juvenile courts. There is a guiding principle to be evidence-based in order to, support juvenile drug treatment courts to identify the strategies that are most likely to result in positive outcomes. And so that research component, that evidence component, is a foundational principle behind the guidelines and something that we hope will be highlighted more in the presentation today. And then also that the guidelines themselves are guided by adolescent development and family engagement. And so again, if you were interested in a little bit more background on what that means and how we translated that into the guidelines, that is in some of the background documents, but it is an important sort of point to keep in mind when we're presenting the research that it is very focused on the youth and youth populations and sort of how youth are developmentally different than adults. And so I will briefly now, okay, thank you, show, this is a screenshot, so if you go to the link that's in the web links here, this is your home page, and so I'm not, again, going to sort of go through it. It's just a screenshot of it. I will say the manuscript, the whole book, like Jessica said, is available on the website, and then these colorful blocks are interactive. So after today, if you want to go back and say, what did Roger say about Objective 1, Statement 1.1, you can go in here, sort of navigate through it, and dive deeper into the content as well. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Roger to kick us off on the guidelines and diving in a little bit deeper here.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So, so this is the map of the guidelines. So what this basically shows you under each of the 7 objectives, right? So those are numbered 1 through 7. Then you can see the individual guideline statements, right? And those are in the circles. So under Objective 1, we have Guideline 1.1, Guideline 1.2, and so on, right? And so those, so this map gives you a sense of the full scope of the guidelines. For today's session, so this is part 1, we're going to cover Objective 1, 2, and 3. So we'll make it through those 3, and then we'll cover Objectives 4, 5, 6, and 7 on Part 2 of the webinar, which is coming up in a couple weeks. So I'm going to be sharing the duties here with Nancy and Jessica. So for each of the guideline statements, I will walk through some of the key parts of the research evidence, right? And the research evidence is what helped us really come to the statement that is provided in the guidelines, right? So they had to meet a particular standard of evidence in order to be a guideline statement. So I'll highlight some of the primary research evidence that supports that statement. And then Nancy will talk about some of the practical considerations that apply for that guideline. And when we get to the end of the objective, then Jessica will spend some time highlighting some of the resources that are available that are relevant for the various guidelines under that objective. And at that time, we'll also address some of the questions that have been coming in that pertain to the guidelines here. So we'll start with Guideline 1.1. Guideline 1.1 is that the team of the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court should be composed of stakeholders that are committed to the philosophy and practice of the court, and that there is ongoing program and system improvement, a commitment to that, and that would cut across all of the people that are involved. The team should also include collaborative relationships with community partners. So the research really that underlies or provides the foundation here. And this research cuts across not just juvenile drug treatment courts, but other youth serving and other juvenile justice programs. We know that when organizations that serve youth across several systems work together to identify common goals, agree to share resources, right, across those various systems, and then coordinate effectively through a strong stakeholder team, that we get, those are more successful interventions. We get more positive outcomes, that the youth do better in those programs, more likely to graduate. So that's really the basis for this guideline statement. I'm going to let Nancy take over here.
Thanks, Roger. Good afternoon, everybody. So just a couple of practice considerations here. For those of you who have been involved in juvenile drug treatment courts for quite some time, none of this will be a surprise to you, that the role of the court in coordinating the services needs to be clearly spelled out in your policy manual. The court's responsibility to oversee the delivery of services is critical. Monitoring the agency's compliance with court referrals goes a little bit beyond the judge just asking in court what's going on. But the judge needs to know a bit about what are the kind of treatment services that are being provided, are they evidence-based, and throughout the drug court programming, we saw a lot of creative approaches to providing services, not quite the same as you would in a traditional probation caseload. This next theme you'll hear coming up in several of the guidelines, and it's around cross-training for staff and for the judge, really talking about people's roles, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next guideline, but talking about people's roles so that everyone can understand where each other is coming from, and I'll flesh that out a little bit more in another guideline. Roger.
Okay. So as Nancy gave in terms of the preview, so the research was also clear that it was important element of the collaboration that the individual team roles were clarified, but also that there was clarity around how each role fit within the entire team and the dynamic of that team. So that's going to be important to provide. And also, the research clarified too that one of the issues here is that if individual partners are not on the same page, right, so that they're all interpreting the actions of the youth in different ways, then that can undermine, right, the ability of the team to work collaborative, right? So there's a lapse in or potentially duplication of services and potentially overall confusion. And then that's related to different outcomes for various youth as well. So important to provide clarity here.
And as we were talking to folks in the field during the development of the guidelines, it became clear to us that this actual documentation and broad discussions about each other's role was so critical. And just an example for you that we heard a lot when we were out in the field. A probation officer, for example, might be focused on youth and community safety and compliance with the rules of probation, while a therapist is focused more on relationship building, understanding the drivers of the youth's behavior. So if those roles aren't clear among the team members, you could have someone looking at the probation officer saying, "Why are you being so hard-nosed about this?" Well, that's the probation officer's job, is to make sure that the youth is compliant. Or looking at the therapist saying, "Why don't you care about us holding this youth in compliance?" Not that a therapist wouldn't care, but a therapist is more focused on the underlying causes. So really understanding and appreciating each other's role, critically important.
So Guideline 1.3 gets to the role of, or the involvement of local school systems. So the team should include participants from the local school systems with the goal of overcoming the educational barriers that the participants face. So there's 4 key things that really sort of emerge from the literature here, the research. So we know that schools can be barriers if they're not cooperating with or investing in the youth, and if they're quick to push the kids out of the school system. That is a complication for what the court is trying to accomplish. We know that when youth are not attending school, that they tend to have higher numbers of referrals for delinquent behavior. And on the flip side of that, when they're fully engaged in school or productively engaged in school, that's a protective factor, right? And when kids are doing better in school, both academically and behaviorally, they tend to be less likely to be using substances. Or it helps them in terms of working on their recovery too. And so for all those reasons, right, this is a vital connection that is worth really emphasizing in your team.
And in practice, this is a little tricky because the kids may all be in different schools. You may have a school that only occasionally has a child that's involved in the drug court team. So really thinking about what are creative ways to involve the school, even if you can't have a school representative at every one of your staffings, at every one of your court hearings. Keeping that open communication with the school is critical because educational goals have to be a priority for each youth. Looking at tracking their progress, school attendance, keeping up with homework, staying out of trouble in school, all the things that contribute to educational success. A number of juvenile drug courts hold hearings and meetings at schools. Families might find it easier to participate at the school rather than at the courthouse. Another important thing that was raised in the literature is that parents and guardians really need to be trained to advocate on behalf of their children's educational rights. Also, it's critically important with this population of youth to be, again, creative, to find the best fit for each participant because they may not necessarily thrive in mainstream public secondary schools.
So guideline 1.4 focuses on the preparation of the team members, right? So should ensure that the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court should ensure that all team members have equal access to high-quality, regular training and technical assistance to improve staff capacity to operate the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court and deliver related programming effectively. So the research is clear that staff at all levels, so this is going to apply to the court and all of the collaborating agencies, but staff at all levels should be trained to understand the purpose, what's the impact of the program, and how it aligns with the agency's mission, right? And the research says that when there's regular training, that helps the staff build up their skills and be able to manage cases effectively. That's going to be helpful to keep people connected to the mission, and also to minimize staff turnover. It's also going to be helpful as there is staff turnover to make sure people get up to speed. And the research also points to the availability of high-quality technical assistance as another means of making sure that there's staff capacity to deliver the program effectively.
One of the things that we heard in developing the guidelines is that it would be really helpful to have a list of training topics that can be used just as a baseline. So I promise I won't read all the slides to you, but I think that this one is important, that training and technical assistance should focus on, obviously, substance abuse disorders, the dynamics of recovery, staff effective case management and skill development, screening and assessments, adolescent development, cultural competence in working with youth and families, family engagement, and use of effective contingency management strategies, incentives, and sanctions. Again, as Roger was saying, the research really talks about the importance of the participants and the team members really understanding the purpose of each intervention and its value and how it aligns with the JDTC's mission. Training is also critically important on the effective use of evidence-based practices in substance use treatment. As we were out in the field, we didn't come across a juvenile drug treatment court that wasn't offering treatment. The big question became how many were offering treatment that was evidence-based. So training around that is critical.
Okay, so Guideline 1.5 is the first of a few that we have throughout the guidelines that really focus on the engaging parents and guardians. So JDTCs should be deliberate about engaging parents or guardians throughout the court process, which includes addressing the specific barriers to their full engagement. And so the research here it was clear, right? The evidence has built up that when parents are not providing support, that's a predictor of program failure, that those kids are more likely to not successfully complete the drug treatment court program. And we know that when parents and guardians don't support the courts, there's a greater likelihood that their kids are not going to succeed. We also have evidence that if the family can be engaged to support the youth to do better in the court program, then that can result in improvement in the family and in the home, right? So there seems to be sort of a feedback loop here, right? That if you can engage the families, then the kids are going to do better in the court, but then also they're going to be doing better in the home too. And we know that improvement can be sustained beyond the court program. So that's important.
So we hear all the time, families need to be involved, family needs to be involved. What does that mean? This guideline really speaks to walking the walk, not just talking the talk. It's important for the court to think broadly about who is considered family. The only people that can tell us that are the family themselves. Families need to have a primary role in making decisions for their child's care and treatment. So often, families are told what's best for their child. But if we are truly engaging families, truly walking the walk, we are asking them to help decide what's best for their children. And on the flip side, when that doesn't happen, participants shouldn't be negatively affected if their family cannot participate. In terms of the court, I've worked with courts for about 35 years, and it is extremely rare that I've ever seen a court hearing that doesn't happen between 9 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And with this population, because we are bringing them before the court so often, it's really important for courts to think about when are they holding the hearings? Can the parents actually get there? The physical settings where the hearings are being held. Is there mass transportation? Can families get there? Engaging the family, really talking to them about what pieces of the court process itself are barriers for them, and involving them in resolving those barriers is really important.
So Guideline 1.6 is an example of a guideline that could have fit under another one, but we felt like it was important to separate these out so that it didn't get lost, right? So if we think about, the notion of, making sure that families are engaged and how that support's going to be critical for the young person to be successful in the program, one aspect of that is that when there's a language barrier, when the family is not engaged because there are barriers there because of their level of acculturation or the language, that by itself is significant. So for the courts that have a population where there are going to be a significant number of kids that come from families that are where English may not be the native language, and this point is going to be a critical one. And so the Guideline 1.6 is that the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court should provide court-certified or licensed on-site interpreters for parents or guardians with limited English proficiency, and for those with a hearing deficiency as well. And in addition, all documents should be translated into the native language for the youth and the parents or guardians.
So in practice, pretty much the same thing that Roger was talking about. One caution, and it really does happen in some drug courts, never ask the youth to interpret to the parents. The use of court-certified interpreters is critically important, not only in court, but for therapists, for social workers, and there are various levels of certification for court interpreters. Your court staff will know all about that. If they don't have certified interpreters in a given language, they can tell you what interpreters they often use in the court. It's really important because the legalese in the court system is difficult sometimes for interpreters that don't have experience in that system.
All right, so now Jessica's going to talk about some resources that apply to these this objective here.
I sure am. All right, so resources are vitally important because I think, as you guys are all thinking, yeah, okay, but how do we actually do this? And so the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has created a lot of resources. We are also being joined now by the American University, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, to provide resources, and there are a number of great resources for you on the website. I've gathered the ones that are pertinent to each one of these objective statements on these slides, these next two slides. And so if you download the PowerPoint, which you can do from the Files window, if you see there's the window to the right of the PowerPoint that says Files 3, you will click on the February 8th webinar, JDTC Guidelines, And then you'll click Download File, which is there at the bottom of the window. And if you do that, that will download this PowerPoint, so you'll have access to these things. But if you go up to the web links and you go to the guidelines that is online and interactive, all of these resources are also linked there. But we do spend a lot of time creating resources for you. So if you want to know about kind of what the job is of each person on the team, we have a publication about the roles and responsibilities. We have one bench card actually just for judges, so you can find out a little bit more about how to be a judge in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. And then there's a lot of training resources. So we've been working with the Center for Court Innovation to create content for Drug Court Online, which has not only juvenile drug court information, but that's where there are a lot of modules, training modules, video. You can hear practitioners talking about their jobs in the program. So that's a great resource for training. We also have all of our webinars recorded, just like this one is. So you can go there and check those out. And then at Georgetown University, they have a number of resources for like multi-system collaboration and those sorts of things. And so those are also available to you. And many of these resources are free. When we're thinking about engaging schools, as Nancy said, this is one of those things where we see better outcomes for kids if we really do have educational representation. But what that looks like is really, really different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so we have in our publication, Engaging Schools, some ideas about how to do that. But I don't have anything that's 100% yet. So as you're listening to us talk, think about how you can also be a resource for other courts in your field. So if you think that you have really a great way to engage with your schools and you have maybe an educational representative that serves, send us an email. Well, that's something we'd like to highlight because this is an area, again, where there's tons of different approaches, and I think it's great to really just highlight different ways that people are looking at this. And that's the same with engaging families. So we have resources, and you can see them here, and we have new ones coming out we have actually a new one that will be published in another week or two, and we have lots of new things that are planned for the coming year. But again, there's no substitute for what practitioners are actually doing. So if you have thoughts and ideas, we'd be happy to highlight those. And then finally, we do have links to how you can get in touch with interpreters if you need them for your court. So we want to make sure that you have all of the resources you need to really do this to the best of your abilities. With that said, I want to talk about your questions. And Roger and Nancy, I'm going to ask you guys to chime in, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about these questions that have come in. I did get a question that actually I think is for me about, are there CLE credits for this? And I will say yes, you can get a CLE credit. If you'd like to receive a credit, you can email either myself or Eloisa Chaparro, who's been sending out the notices to tell you about the webinars and the links and the logins. And either one of us can take care of getting you CLE credits. All right, so the question, are there recommendations about how to most effectively determine team members? In some jurisdictions, there are various entities to choose from. So Roger, when you were looking at the research, did you find anything about team members that are really specific to juvenile drug treatment courts?
So I think the answer to this is no. Now, so that you can, there is some good evidence out there about which entities need to be represented on the team, right? So all of the different roles that need to be included. But in terms of like who makes up the best, like who the best probation officer would be, what their characteristics would be, or who the best defense attorney would be, we did not find evidence at that level to include.
So, but we do kind of know that we want a judge and a defense attorney, a prosecuting attorney, treatment provider, a coordinator. And there's another question that came in about the coordinator who in some places coordinators don't exist, or they also serve as probation officers. Do we have anything in the research that kind of talks about having a dedicated coordinator versus having a split coordinator or no coordinator?
in the guidelines themselves, there's an extensive list of who the different roles are. So we did not present that here today on the webinar, but we do have that. That is included in the document. I'm not sure if it precludes or if it there is a key role for the coordinator and a key role for the probation officer. But there's no, I guess the evidence doesn't say that can't be the same person if those two roles could effectively be done, by a single person, right? There probably are some jurisdictions where those responsibilities could be handled by a single person, but there are key roles, or key responsibilities for each of the roles.
And when we're thinking about schools, was ESSA considered? And ESSA, for those of you who might not know, stands for the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so was that one of the things that you drew on when you were thinking about education in our treatment courts?
So I think the answer here is no. Now, I guess I don't know for sure if that was considered by the. So we, much of the research that we included was research done by other researchers, right? So we did meta-analyses and systematic reviews, which is a way to integrate information across a number of studies. So I'm not going to remember off the top of my head if any of the studies that we drew from about the school, partnering with the school, if any of them considered ESSA. That's a possibility. But we did not independently consult that initiative, that law in order to, or that policy, right, in order to pull together the guideline statement that we have.
Okay. And Nancy, I wondered when you were talking with courts, did you get any indication of how courts are kind of looking at the confidentiality issues with schools and how they're working with schools who sometimes have sort of draconian zero-tolerance policies? Did we see anything about that?
Good question, Jessica. And when we were out in the field, and I might have mentioned this, the one representative that was so most often absent was the school. So we didn't have a lot of confidentiality conversations just because they weren't there. So I think talking about that in the context of state law may be a path to take. And we really didn't have a lot of conversation about the hardline school that is immediately removing children, but that is one of the key things that the partnership with the school needs to be focused on, because schools are all too quick so often to remove children immediately. And with the youth that are involved in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court, helping the school understand that these youth have a plethora of services and supports wrapped around them to help them be successful in school, it may help the school then back off on that rigid stance of one time and you're out.
I agree, and I think this is one of those areas where now that we're seeing that there's really some strong evidence that having school representation on the team and really focusing on education is leading to better outcomes for our kids in our treatment courts, I think this is a chance then for us at the national level to really help create some new tools and to maybe kind of do a deeper dive into some of those issues. So, so stay tuned, folks. So I have just a couple of more questions I want us to talk about before we move on to the next objectives. There was somebody who asked about the idea that law enforcement should be represented on the team. And I know this is a core team member now on the adult drug court. What are we seeing for juveniles?
We did have law enforcement representation on several of the teams that we visited, and the interesting thing that we heard in our interviews, and Roger talked about this a little bit with one of the earlier guidelines, the importance of having people who believe in the mission of the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. And what we saw were police who really did share in a true belief of that mission. And it actually was kind of magical. We did attend one drug court graduation, and the first person that the graduate went to hug was the police officer who had been with her every step of the way through the drug court process. So that relationship can certainly work if you've got an officer who believes in the mission.
And so, but we don't have, Roger, from the research something to say yes or no one way or the other?
So it is not one of the roles that is sort of identified as a key role on the team. That is true.
All right. And then I had
Quickly, Jessica, one of the things that we talk about all the time when we hear questions from the field is the fact that, and Roger said this, we relied on the body of evidence that's out there now. All of these things that are still coming up as questions are things that would be wondrous for local teams to partner with universities, study further, because we definitely did identify gaps in the research.
Oh, sure. I think that that's one of the things that the guidelines really is showing us and showing the field is where we can concentrate our efforts in knowing where best practice is, but it also really has raised, I think, a number of questions, and it's really exciting to be working in the field right now because I think there's such an opportunity to really dig in and find out and be creative and hopefully, be part of something that's going to move practice forward. So with regards to engaging parents, what kind of recommendations do we want to make around parents that have their own substance abuse issues, maybe parents that are using medical marijuana? This comes up over and over again for teams, and they really struggle with it. And I think it's one of those harder things to talk about when we talk about how to engage parents in our juvenile drug treatment courts.
Absolutely, and so this is one of those I mentioned, when I was touching on the one guideline statement. So there are a number of specific guideline statements throughout the guidelines that touch on, how we engage the family, and one of them coming up in Objective 4, so we won't get to it today, but looks at the importance of really doing careful assessment of what's going on with the families, right? The parent substance use, the mental health issues with the parents too, other issues in the family, and then also providing connections to treatment resources where they're needed, so that it's also about helping the family be a healthier environment for the young person as well. So that does get addressed, but that gets addressed in later later objectives.
All right, great. So the last one then is when we think about regular training for the staff on the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. What kind of training are we recommending? Is attending the yearly state problem-solving court conference enough, or should they be looking for other things or cheaper things?
That's a really good question. So there is, if you look at Guideline 1.4, there is actually a list of the different topics that is a minimum. So that's the minimum set of or areas that there should be training provided in, right? And so that's pretty clear. So we encourage the courts to really take that to heart, and try to be, as comprehensive as they can in addressing all of those. The folks that are providing TA to the field, which includes NCJ, FCJ, right there, they've been working for years, right, to provide training in many of these areas. I'm going to venture to guess that most of these topics are covered in training at conferences, but also webinars that are provided by the TA providers, other materials that are available, and I don't want to overreach here because I'm not working with the TA providers, but I will hear later in this call how there can be requests made for technical assistance, and I believe there are very low cost to no cost options for juvenile drug treatment courts to get this kind of training and technical assistance.
Yeah, so I would say that the folks should be seeking out training and technical assistance early, often, and in multiple ways. And so going to state conferences and the national conference are great for some things, but we do have a ton of resources online, and the links are there. There are links on the Guidelines webinar or website itself, and then we can come out and work directly with courts in local jurisdictions. And right now the funding is there, and so it's at no charge to folks who are interested in that kind of direct assistance. So if you're interested, then certainly send us an email and let us know that you want some service. And so with that, I think we should move on to talking about number 2.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
All right, so now we're to Objective 2, and Objective 2 really focuses on equity of access, but also the eligibility criteria as well, too. So Guideline 2.1 lays out eligibility criteria for juvenile drug treatment courts. This is based on the research, and so the eligibility criteria should include the following: that youth should have a substance use disorder, they should be at least 14 years or older, and have moderate to high risk for reoffending. The evidence was really clear here. We know that when kids have substance use disorders, that they do better in terms of completing the drug treatment court programs. They benefit from the treatment that's provided, and that's compared to kids who are using drugs and alcohol but don't have a substance use disorder. In a recent evaluation of Reclaiming Futures, which it was integrated with juvenile drug courts, they found that when participating youth had substance use disorder and delinquency problems, and there was strict program eligibility, that there were better outcomes particularly in terms of reduced substance use. But we also know, the research is clear, that when the courts limit to the higher risk, so the more with substance use disorder, that we have better outcomes with regard to recidivism as well. Recidivism for just general delinquency outcomes. We do know the research also points to that when kids are lower risk, that they actually do worse, right? So they are harmed by being in these programs. So we want to try to avoid that. And with regard to the age, so the evidence is that kids that are 14 and older do better. And so again, more likely to complete, less likely to recidivate. The evidence seems to suggest that this is about maturity, perhaps motivation too, and it's tied to the ability of the young person to really work under a system which is the contingency management, right? The incentives and the sanctions. That the more mature the young person is, the more likely that that's going to influence their behavior in ways that's productive.
So this is the guideline from which we probably heard the greatest hue and cry from the field. Just in terms of definitions, when the guideline refers to substance abuse or use disorders, it's referring both to substance abuse and substance dependence. And as Roger said, the intensity of the juvenile drug court program makes older youth and youth who are a medium to high risk for reoffending particularly well suited for the drug court intervention. In the courts that we visited and the courts that we spoke with on the phone, we actually heard more times than I'd like to count that lower level offenders were being served by the program because the program had a responsibility to keep the numbers up in terms of keeping its funding. The research is clear here that lower risk youth do worse in these kind of programs, and as Roger said, can actually be harmed by penetrating them so deep into a system that they may not need to be in at all. And we'll talk about that in another guideline. On the flip side of that, youth who exceed these criteria and present with additional common co-occurring characteristics can be served in the drug court. We did visit a co-occurring court that focused both on substance abuse and mental health disorders, and their partnership obviously with the mental health services in their community was exceptionally strong, and kids were doing well in that program. Because the research shows that this kind of programming is most effective for youth that are 14 and over, if you do decide to enroll participants that are younger than 14, really need to be talking about providing additional support and accommodations for those youth.
All right, so the next few guidelines really talk about how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're focusing on the right youth? All right, so the guideline 2.2 is that you're assessing all program participants for the risk of reoffending using a validated instrument, and that evidence here is very clear across multiple studies and juvenile justice focused and even in the drug treatment court focus, that before you provide treatment, the most effective juvenile justice programs use validated risk assessment instruments to make sure that each young person meets the criteria, right? So again, moderate to high risk for reoffending.
The practice considerations really just track very closely with what Roger just said. As we've said, youth who are assessed at high, medium to high risk for reoffending are most appropriate. Those assessed at low risk really need to be diverted from the juvenile court process. And this one, for those of you in the field, is a little bit of a duh. Higher risk youth need to receive a higher level of treatment and programming.
So guideline 2.3 then gets at how do we assess for substance use disorders. And again, you should use validated and culturally responsive assessments. And we do know, the research is clear, that when you use high-quality assessments, you get the kind of information that's really going to help you determine the suitability and eligibility of those participants for the court program here. It also, again, right, increases the likelihood that the young people are going to successfully complete the program if you're working with with those participants who actually meet this criteria. And again, because it's also appropriate to include kids in the program that have co-occurring mental health issues, you want to also assess those as well. And there are a number of screening tools available that can help you assess for substance use disorder and also the co-occurring mental health issues.
So when we're talking about standardized screening and assessment, what do we mean? We're talking about tools that are delivered in a specific way every time and are supported by a body of research that demonstrates their reliability and validity. The next part of this is critically important, and that they've been tested for use with the specific population that the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court serves. We visited treatment courts in which there was a very high percentage of children of color in the treatment court. So if you are using a risk assessment tool that has not been normed for the cultural cultural background of the kids that you're serving, it may be the wrong instrument. So that is a critically important thing to consider. And a trained clinician obviously conducts the highest quality evaluations. We did see evaluations that were done by coordinators, assessments that were done by probation officers, and the guidelines really recommend that those be done by a trained clinician.
All right. And then Guideline 2.4 addresses, what do you do if you have participants that don't have a substance use disorder and are not assessed as moderate or high risk for reoffending? They should be diverted at least from the JDTC process, right? So maybe perhaps from the juvenile court process, but at least they should not be enrolled in and expected to participate in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. So we've said a couple of times that we know that lower risk youth that being in juvenile justice programs can actually lead to more negative outcomes, right? And one of the reasons that the research points to is that, being in a juvenile justice program can actually be disruptive to the kinds of things that make these young people lower risk in the first place, right? So if their schooling might be interrupted, they might lose their job, it may disrupt the relationships they have with their family and peers, and so it's really important to be thoughtful about who you're engaging in the program, and want to make sure that we're thoughtful about. The research is clear that by itself, just processing in the juvenile justice system can increase the involvement that the young person has in delinquency in all aspects, right? How often it's happening, the prevalence, and even the severity of the delinquency over time. And then we also, and the guideline document goes into much more detail on this too. So there's a body of evidence about early intervention programs, which are brief interventions that are designed for young people who are involved with drugs and alcohol, but don't have a substance use disorder. And those programs have been shown to be effective.
So the bottom line is that juvenile drug treatment courts should not be engaging youth who don't meet the minimum eligibility criteria. That was a very tough message to deliver, and it was one, as I said, that created the largest response. In terms of the early intervention programs, obviously they can be operated effectively in community-based settings. They cost less than the treatment court. They generally include motivational interviewing and evidence-based interaction, enhancement strategies, and they are more effective when they are not a one-time or two-time shot at interacting with the youth. They're more effective when they involve multiple contacts.
Okay, and then the last guideline under Objective 2 is to ensure that eligibility criteria actually result in equity of access. Equity of access for all genders, racial and ethnic groups, and youth who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, and gender nonconforming, and two-spirit. And again, there's lots of research here that both male and female youth from minority, racial, and ethnic backgrounds are underrepresented among the graduates, right? They might not be underrepresented entering the courts into the programs, but they're underrepresented among the graduates. So they're not doing as well in the programs. And there's various factors that contribute to what appears to be, what ends up being disparate treatment in the programs across the different groups. And we also, the research is clear that there may be compromises to the implementation quality and how engaged young people are when the programs are not a good fit. Not a good fit in terms of the cultural, the physical, or the socioeconomic context. So it's clear that there is not one model of juvenile drug treatment court that's going to be effective across a variety of settings or with a variety of youth, and that's something that needs to be really taken into careful consideration for each court team.
This is, in practice, a difficult conversation to have sometimes among the teams. If we are not addressing the racial and ethnic disparity, gender responsiveness needs, disparate experiences of youth with different orientations, we are not serving them well. one of the things that that we talked about at some length is the importance of team members actually exploring themselves. What affects their decision making? Are they making the same decisions for one group of youth as they are for another group of youth? So not just looking at that kind of technical training that helps you understand how to deal with cultures more effectively, but really looking at your own decision making as a treatment team member. We should be looking always at approaches that are gender and culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and developmentally appropriate. These require courageous conversations among the team members and are not, this is not a guideline that can be easily implemented by book learning, if you will.
All right, so we have a number of resources available for you, and I noticed a lot of our questions that were coming up were around kind of like what is the best screening and assessment tool to use and that kind of thing. And so this is where to come to look for that. We don't have specific recommendations because there are a number of tools out there, and a lot of your states tell you what tool to use. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that it's validated and ideally normed on the population that you're going to be serving, as Nancy mentioned. And so you'll want to be looking at that, both for risk and need and also for substance use. I know we had a question that came in that asked about the diagnosis or the indicator of substance use disorder, and that's actually a level of care indicator that treatment providers receive, saying that they're at a substance use disorder level. The question was really about, are we not calling substance use and addiction, are we not using disease framing when we're talking about it? But I don't believe that's the case with that particular designation. I believe it's more about making sure that you have kids that are using enough that they rise to the need for a level of care. Roger, is that an appropriate interpretation of the question?
I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think we were intentional, and this was guidance that we got from the field, that that there's a move to really thinking about this in terms of substance use disorder, and so that does include. I mean, there's if you look at the guidelines themselves, there's some connections to where you go to get more information about what's included in that. What does that mean? How is that different than a previous conception? But it seems to be more inclusive. So it does include substance abuse, and so so I think it's more inclusive, and I think it's just perhaps a different framing that is where the field is currently.
And when you were looking at the research, did you notice if there were any kinds of issues and diagnoses that would preclude somebody from participating in a juvenile drug court? Some kinds of personality disorders. I know we sometimes see sex offenders excluded just as a matter of course, but was there anything in the research that really pointed that direction?
There was not. So I think and again, this will be more directly addressed in Guideline 4, or Objective 4 and Objective 5. But the key focus is to make sure that once there's a careful needs assessment done, that the treatment addresses. So there may be kids who have more profound needs. So it's not just a substance use disorder, but there are other mental health disorders or trauma, right? And so there are other forms of treatment that may be called for there that are going to be important along with the substance use treatment to address.
Great. And we did have a couple of folks who were more commenting about race and culture and ethnicity, and how we kind of sometimes conflate all of those sorts of words, but they're really very distinctive. And Lynetta, Jesse from OJJDP, I was hoping you could kind of talk a little bit about OJJDP's approach to racial and ethnic disparities in kids of color. And I know this is something that on the training and technical assistance side, we're working to create better and more resources around, but why don't you talk a little bit about kind of OJJDP's viewpoint here?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to say first thank you for the field for your comments and your interest in this topic. This is a topic, a priority topic for OJJDP. As an agency, we know that there's much more to be done to address racial equity disparities, both in juvenile drug treatment courts and in our overall juvenile justice work. So as we continue, we do prioritize the RED work as one of our #1 priorities. The guidelines are a framework from research to practice where we address the equity through various pieces of the guidelines in regards to access, cultural responsiveness, and even other areas. Moving forward, we would like to unpack this discussion. And just as Nancy said, this is not a textbook discussion. This is where we all have to be interactive in the discussion. And what we come up with from the field, the input of the field, and our researchers, that will help us to develop some practical tools for the field to move this conversation forward and to address it within our courts. So our priority and our overarching goal is to make sure the court processes and treatment are equitable and fair for all youth who enter our juvenile drug treatment courts.
Wonderful. And I think what we're going to do right now, because we have about 17 minutes left, is we're going to just move on and talking about objective statement number 3. And one of the things we're thinking about, folks, is doing another webinar after we're completed with this one and the next one that's just going to be question and answers. It's where you can really spend a lot of time just asking all of these questions because it seems obvious that you all have a ton of questions. And we can do it in a slightly different format, so there'll be a little more give and take, and we can have, instead of just the question pod, we'll have the chat pod back, and we can do some conversing that way. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Roger, to go through the last one over these last 17 minutes or so.
Okay, very good. All right, so Objective 3 starts to look at the structure of the drug treatment court and how the different professionals involved are going to participate here. Guideline 3.1 again comes back to the notion of how important it is for the juvenile drug treatment courts to work collaboratively with parents and guardians throughout the process, right, and to encourage active participation in regular court hearings and supervision and discipline of their children in the home and the community and also in treatment programs as well. And so here again, so some of this we've already touched on in terms of the research. You know, that it's clear that, you know, youth do better in the drug treatment court if their parents are engaged. It appears from the research that when the parents are not willing to participate, that can have a detrimental effect on the young person in terms of how they participate in the program. There's also research that shows that when families are engaged in family therapy, that can have benefits in terms of more fully engaging the parents and guardians in the court process, and also too that there's evidence that shows that courts can be effective in helping parents and guardians build their skills around parenting practices, supervision in particular, and that, again, that those improvements in the parenting practices can be sustained after the young people leave the court or graduate from the court.
So in practice, and we talked about this earlier, it's really about truly collaborating with families, walking the walk, not talking the talk. I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone that parents and guardians often find the court process alienating, intimidating, And we really need to be thinking about what is it we are asking parents to do. If they are not fully engaged as an equal team member, then the chances of them feeling positive about the court experience are pretty low. Parents may feel like the team is not culturally competent. Again, a huge area where we need to do so much more work. I think also when we're thinking about what is it we're asking parents to do, it's so important to look outside of your own box in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. There was a study done in the state of Oregon some years ago that showed that 20% of the families used 80% of the court services. That's how many families had multiple cases pending. And when they do have multiple cases pending in multiple different courts, we may be asking parents to run one way for one case, run another way for another case. So the importance of coordinating and consolidating these cases so we are being reasonable about what we are asking parents to do and truly treating them as an equal member of the team is critically important.
Okay, Guideline 3.2 addresses that the judge should interact with the participants in a non-judgmental and procedurally fair manner. So non-judgmental here, the key is that they're not just focused on coming to a judgment, but they're holding the young person accountable because there's a structure in which they've established goals and they're using the graduated incentives and sanctions effectively. So that's going to be important. It's also going to be important that judges are intervening in ways that increase the young person's self-esteem. And then finally, the evidence is clear that when young people experience the decision-making of the court as fair, then they're more likely to view that as legitimate, and their compliance increases with the procedures of the court.
So in practice, we heard a lot, we saw a lot of teams talking about parental engagement, and when we went into the courtroom, the parents weren't asked a single question. They were observers in the process. So we really need to be focused on youth and parents both participating in the proceedings. It's a little bit tricky when you're working in such a collaborative team effort. You're getting together, you're having staffings, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You're having staffings, you're coming to a collaborative decision on what's best for the youth and the family, and then you walk into the courtroom and that's what happens. And the youth and the family haven't been heard. So critically important for the youth and the families to see the judge as neutral, respectful, working closely with not only the team, but equally or more importantly, them as well.
Okay, Guideline 3.3, the judge should be consistent when applying program requirements that includes incentives and sanctions here. So let's talk about the consistency here that we're referring to. So it's consistent across the full Juvenile Drug Treatment Court program. And that doesn't mean, so the research is clear that this doesn't mean that that youth are receiving the same incentives and sanctions as every other youth, but that to the extent that they're individualized, they're done in a way that's applied then consistently for that youth. And the youth can predict what's going to happen based on their behavior. You know, what kind of incentive might be applied versus what kind of sanction might be applied as well, too. And the evidence is clear that we get better outcomes in the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court process when judges are using positive reinforcement, and that's part of the way that they're applying the incentives and sanctions.
So when we talk about consistency and sanctions, as Roger said, we're not talking about everybody gets the same thing, because it's very easy to say one relapse and this is the consequence, two relapses, this is the consequence, when those decisions really need to be made by judges with an eye toward the immediate and long-term goals of the youth. So it may not be appropriate to give the same sanction for one youth as you did for another, depending on what the goals are immediately, midterm, long-term for those kids. Individualized plans for each youth need to be developed, and the responses are consistent. We did hear a lot from the field. How can you say you want the responses to be consistent when you want the plans to be individualized? What we did see out in the field, and it was blatantly obvious, was that girls were getting softer sanctions than boys in some of the programs that we observed and talked to. And that's just one example. So individualized yet consistent. And the research does show that sanctions that are applied inconsistently can actually reinforce undesirable behavior instead of diminish it, the opposite of what the program is looking for.
All right, and then Guideline 3.4. So the team should meet weekly to review progress for participants and consider incentives and sanctions based on reports of each participant's progress across all aspects of the treatment plan. Now, we say weekly here. I do want to clarify that. So this should correspond with the frequency in which the program is having the young person appear in court. So as they progress to higher levels in the program, and perhaps they're coming to court less often, the meetings would correspond to that frequency as well. So just to make that clear. But the doing individualized reassessments, including looking at the risk level, can help inform the way the court is making decisions about supervision and sanctions and incentives, and so it's going to be important. And the staff meetings have a better impact when input is coming in from all of the participating agencies, all of the partner agencies, right? And also, too, the research points to that there's a balance, right? So you do need to take into account the number and types of cases that you can effectively serve with this process, and so thinking about caseloads in that regard.
We saw a really widespread difference in the use of weekly staffings. And I think taking a look at the research and the guideline that talks about, you got to be really careful about the number of youth that are being served by the program, because it becomes impossible to have these kinds of in-depth conversations about each youth if there are too many in the program. If you are doing hearings for 50 youth in a 2-hour period and staffing them in 1 hour, you can't possibly be talking about their individualized needs and their long-term goals. Also hotly debated during the guidelines development was the role of parents and youth in the staffings. We didn't see a single court that did involve parents and youth in the staffings. The decisions were made without the parents and youth present. So really considering how you might either provide an opportunity for direct input into the staffing or having them there is an important conversation for the drug court team.
All right, we have a number of resources again. And more are being developed every day. So these are our family engagement ones. And as you can imagine, we spend a lot of time thinking about incentives and sanctions, just like all of you do. So there's a huge list of incentives and sanctions resources. One of the things we didn't really touch on much is the use of detention, but there at the bottom you can see there's a link to the research from the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative talking about the use of detention and how that's not really a great idea, and especially for our kids that we're going to have with us for a long time in a juvenile drug treatment court program. Using detention really can put us into a box where once we've sent kids to detention, our next option is to send them to detention for longer and then longer. And so we should try to have, I always say, 50 responses before we ever get to detention. And so those are things to be considering as we move forward. The guidelines, again, can be found here. And to wrap up, I think we're going to have Lynette and Jesse come back and talk a little bit more about getting training and technical assistance. Lynette?
Hello, everyone. I'm here.
Okay, great.
Don't know how to come off mute. Sorry. I just wanted to talk to you all about your implementation process. A lot of this work around the guidelines is going to require some TTA. So if you're interested in TTA, we've included a link here for you to be able to ask for that training and technical assistance. In addition, we want to make sure that you also register for the next webinar. Excuse me. And given the topics and the discussions and the questions that we are having, we are also thinking about having some really focused webinars on specific guidelines. So to speak, number 2 is what we talked about around race and ethnic disparities. So please stay tuned for what is coming up in terms of the guidelines. And please, please, please get your TTA in, your request in. Thank you.
Great. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. Once again, we'll be having our next webinar in a few weeks. And there are a number of resources for you online. We encourage you to take a look at those. If your question didn't get answered today, and I know there were a number that didn't, you can feel free to email us directly for an answer to your question. Or, as Lynetta said, we're going to be working to get even more stuff out for you guys because it's clear that as a field, you're interested, you're curious, and you want to know more, which is never a bad thing. So thank you all for participating, and we'll see you at the next one.